The vision came not as a gentle revelation, but as a shared seizure of the soul, a cataclysm of the mind that left no room for doubt. One moment, Ezekiel and Seraphina were kneeling in their small Kentucky farmhouse, the worn floorboards groaning under their weight as they offered their evening prayers. The next, the world dissolved into a blinding, golden-white light that smelled of ozone and burning cedar. They saw it together, their hands clasped so tightly their knuckles blanched. The world outside their window consumed by a silent, holy fire, cities crumbling to dust, and the wicked swept away in a divine, cleansing wind. And in the profound, echoing silence that followed the imagined destruction, a single, undeniable truth was seared into their consciousness. They were the sole survivors, the new Adam and Eve, chosen by God to begin creation anew. For 3 days, they did not leave the house, moving through the familiar rooms as if they were already sacred ground. The mundane world, the ticking of the grandfather clock, the distant whistle of a train, the neighbor's cow lowing in the field, felt like a fading dream, a ghost of a life that had been officially, irrevocably revoked. Seraphina's eyes, once a calm and placid blue, now held a feverish intensity, seeing not the chipped paint on the walls, but the blueprint of a new Eden. Ezekiel's voice, usually reserved for Sunday hymns, took on a resonant, prophetic timbre as he spoke of their purpose. They renounced their old lives with a terrifying finality. Seraphina packed a single worn carpetbag with meager supplies. A cast-iron skillet, a bag of dried beans, her mother's tarnished silver cross, and a blank journal whose pages she felt destined to fill with a new scripture. Ezekiel gathered his tools, an axe, a hunting knife, a coil of rope, and the heavy, leather-bound family Bible, its pages now the only law. They did not write letters of farewell. To whom would they write? The world was empty, and those who thought themselves alive were merely phantoms, echoes of a sin-filled past. On the morning of their departure, a cool mist clung to the hollows of the Kentucky hills. Ezekiel stood on the porch of the home they were abandoning, his face turned toward the rising sun. He raised his arms, his silhouette stark against the pale dawn, and declared their divine mission to the silent, sleeping world. His words were not a plea but a decree, a fervent prayer that wove their delusion into the very fabric of reality. They were not fleeing. They were being called. They would found a new sanctuary, a place of purity and obedience. They would call it Hillcrest Colony. And there, in the heart of the wilderness, they would become the progenitors of a new, uncorrupted humanity, their faith the only compass they would ever need. The woods swallowed them whole, the dense Kentucky canopy closing over their heads like the lid of a sacred box. Each step away from the dirt road was a step into their new genesis. The crunch of last autumn's leaves underfoot the only sound in a world they believed they alone inhabited. Ezekiel led with a hunter's certainty, his eyes scanning the ancient oaks and hickories not for trails, but for signs. Seraphina followed, her hand often drifting to the carpetbag she carried, feeling the hard corner of her journal through the fabric, a silent promise of the history she was meant to record. For 2 days they walked, the air growing thicker, the light more filtered and green. The outside world, with its phantom sounds and remembered temptations, fell away until it was nothing but a faint, dismissed hum in the back of their minds. On the 3rd day, they found it. A hidden valley cradled between 2 steep, forested ridges. A small, clear creek cut a silver ribbon through its center, and the earth was soft and rich. Sunlight, in a single golden shaft, broke through the canopy to illuminate a small, flat clearing near the water. It was a place that felt both found and given, a sanctuary prepared for them since the beginning of time. Hillcrest Colony had its birthplace. Work began with a fervor that bordered on desperation, a physical manifestation of their need to make their vision tangible. Ezekiel's axe bit into the trunks of straight, young pines, the rhythmic thwack echoing through the silent valley like a primal heartbeat. Seraphina dragged the felled logs, her slender frame straining with an unnatural strength born of conviction. They fashioned a crude, one-room cabin, its walls leaning slightly, its roof a patchwork of bark and woven branches. It was more hovel than house, but to them it was a temple, the first structure of a new world. While Serafina arranged stones for a hearth inside, Ezekiel took his hunting knife and began his own work. On the trunks of the oldest, most prominent trees surrounding their clearing, he carved. His blade carefully etched the forms of a lamb, a descending dove, a burning bush. He scored crosses and crude Greek letters into the bark, his breath misting in the cool air as he worked. These were not mere markers. They were a declaration of ownership, a sacred warding. He was carving a covenant into the very flesh of the forest, staking their divine claim on this patch of wilderness, creating a holy border between their purity and the remembered corruption beyond. Inside the dim cabin, Serafina sat on a stump, her journal open on her knees. By the faint light filtering through the chinks in the wall, she began to write. Her script was elegant and deliberate, a stark contrast to the roughness of their surroundings. She documented their journey, the discovery of the valley, the raising of the shelter. She wrote of the profound silence, interpreting it not as emptiness but as God's presence, a listening attention. She described the peace of the place, the way the creek's murmur sounded like whispered prayers. She did not write of the blisters on her hands, the deep ache in her muscles, or the small, cold knot of doubt that sometimes tightened in her stomach when the wind howled like a lost thing through the trees at night. Those thoughts were temptations, whispers from the dead world. She ignored them, focusing instead on the smooth glide of her pencil, the creation of a testament that would, one day, be all their children knew of the beginning. Together, in shared, stubborn silence, they built their refuge and ignored the shadows gathering at the edges of their faith. The first ritual began as darkness fell, a deliberate act of creation more sacred than the building of their cabin. As twilight deepened in their hidden valley, Ezekiel built a fire in the stone hearth, its flames casting dancing, monstrous shadows on the rough-hewn walls. He and Serafina knelt before it, their faces illuminated by the flickering light, their postures rigid with purpose. This was to be their nightly gathering, the hour when they would reaffirm their divine roles and bind themselves ever tighter to their mission. From his pocket, Ezekiel produced a single sheet of paper, upon which he had carefully inscribed their new laws in his blocky, forceful script. This was their covenant, the foundational text of Hillcrest Colony. Ezekiel's voice was low and resonant, filling the small cabin as he began to read. The words were his own, a strange and potent blend of biblical phrasing and personal revelation. He declared Serafina the new Eve, the mother of all living, her womb the sacred vessel for a purified race. He named himself the new Adam, the keeper of the gate and the enforcer of God's will. They recited together passages that detailed their required purity, their separation from the phantom world, and their absolute obedience to the signs they were certain God would provide. The fire crackled in agreement, and the wind outside seemed to still, as if the forest itself was listening to the birth of this new dogma. When the recitation was complete, Serafina took her journal. This was her part of the ritual, the act of recording their covenant with God. She opened to a fresh page, her hand steady as she transcribed Ezekiel's words. But then she went further. She began to write of imagined signs, weaving their daily existence into a tapestry of divine favor. The hawk that circled overhead at noon became a messenger confirming their location. The sudden appearance of morel mushrooms by the creek was a sign of God's provision. A flash of lightning in a distant storm was a warning against doubt. She documented these not as observations, but as scripture, her entries building a self-reinforcing mythology where every coincidence was a miracle and every hardship a test of faith. Ezekiel, empowered by the ritual, began his work of purification. The next day, he gathered the few remaining items they had brought from their old life that he deemed tainted. Serafina's one other dress, a simple calico print, was too reminiscent of worldly vanity. It was the first to go, thrown into the fire where it blackened and curled into ash. A tin of buttons, a small mirror, a newspaper fragment used to wrap a piece of cheese. All were deemed corrupting influences, tangible threads connecting them to the sin they had fled. One by one, he consigned them to the flames, his face a mask of grim satisfaction as he watched the physical evidence of the old world dissolve into smoke. He declared that nothing from the time before the vision could remain, that their colony must be a blank slate, scrubbed clean by fire and faith. As the days turned into weeks, the covenant solidified, its rules hardening into unbreakable law. The nightly recitations became the anchor of their existence, the firelit cabin a stage for their performed divinity. Serafina's journal grew thicker with her recorded revelations, its pages a labyrinth of self-justification and fervent belief. And Ezekiel's purges continued, his eyes constantly searching for any hidden contaminant, any forgotten memory made object. The world they were building was not just separate from the one they had left. It was its antithesis, a fortress of delusion constructed word by word and purified by flame, within the heart of the silent, watchful woods. The silence of the valley, once a comforting mantle of divine peace, began to curdle into something watchful and heavy. Months had bled together, marked only by the turning of the leaves from green to a fiery gold and then to a skeletal gray. The vibrant world they had entered in spring was now a monochrome prison of bare branches and iron-hard ground. The isolation, once a chosen state of grace, had become a physical presence, a fourth inhabitant of the crude cabin that breathed the same thin, cold air and listened to the same endless wind. It was in this deepening solitude that their beliefs, once fervent, began to twist into something sharper and more desperate. Ezekiel was the first to show the strain. His vigilance at the borders of their claimed land became a frantic, ceaseless patrol. He would stand for hours at the edge of the clearing, his body rigid, staring into the tangled depths of the forest. He no longer saw just trees and shadow. He saw movement where there was none, heard the snap of a twig that was only the settling of frost. He became convinced that the unclean were circling them, phantom outsiders from the dead world who sought to defile their sanctuary. These were not mere sinners, but grotesque, shadowy figures his mind painted with a paranoid brush. Men with hollow eyes and grasping hands, drawn by the beacon of their purity. He would return to the cabin shivering, his eyes wild, muttering about footprints he could not find and whispers on the wind that only he could hear. He took to sleeping with his axe clutched to his chest, his sleep fractured by jolts of terror at the cry of an owl or the rustle of a possum in the undergrowth. Serafina, in turn, found her solace turning treacherous. The quiet she had once interpreted as God's presence now hummed with a new energy. At first, it was a gentle murmur, a susurration just below the threshold of hearing that she took for divine comfort. But as the weeks wore on, the murmurs coalesced into distinct voices. They came to her not as thunderous commands, but as intimate whispers from the corners of the room, from the crackle of the fire, from the very walls themselves. They praised her faithfulness, confirmed Ezekiel's fears, and offered guidance. They told her which roots were safe to eat, warned her of a coming frost, and affirmed that the barriers must be made stronger. She accepted these auditory visitations with a serene certainty, her journal now filled not just with her own interpretations, but with direct quotations from her unseen counselors. She was the listener, the scribe, and the voices were the final, personal proof of their chosen status. Driven by this dual engine of paranoia and perceived guidance, they turned their energy outward, to the fortification of their holy ground. What had begun as carved symbols on trees became a physical barricade. Together, they spent their days dragging fallen logs and sharpening their ends, creating a ragged, chest-high palisade around the entire perimeter of the clearing. Ezekiel wove thorny blackberry brambles through the gaps, his hands bleeding from a dozen tiny punctures, each drop a sacrifice to their security. Serafina followed, anointing the barrier with creek water she had blessed in the name of their private trinity. It was exhausting, mind-numbing work, but it gave tangible form to their fear and faith. They were not just building a fence. They were building a wall between their revealed truth and the vast, terrifying lie of the world they had left behind. With the final log placed, the last thorny vine woven, they stood together inside their stockade. They had not merely severed their ties to society. They had entombed themselves within their shared delusion, the walls as much a cage for their sanity as a defense against phantoms. The world outside was now officially, irrevocably, the enemy. The pain was a cleansing fire, a holy trial that Serafina endured with gritted teeth, and a soul surrendered to purpose. In the deep of a winter night, with the wind screaming like a banshee around their cabin, she brought their new Genesis into the world. There were no midwives, no comforting hands, only Ezekiel's frantic prayers and the flickering firelight that painted the scene in primal, dancing shadows. When the infant's first cry pierced the storm's roar, it was not the sound of a mere baby, but a trumpet blast announcing the dawn of their prophesied race. Ezekiel held the squirming, blood-slicked form up to the weak light, his own tears cutting tracks through the grime on his face. He saw not a newborn's wrinkled redness, but a being of unblemished potential, the first true human since the fall of the old world. They named him Abel, for he was, in their eyes, the first acceptable offering of this new creation. The following dawn broke clear and brutally cold, the sky a hard, pale blue. The ritual of incorporation began at the creek's edge, where Ezekiel had chopped a hole in the skin of ice. The water beneath was black and biting. Serafina, her body still trembling with exhaustion, stood wrapped in a rough wool blanket, her face a mask of beatific certainty. Ezekiel, holding the swaddled Abel, waded into the numbing water until it soaked his legs to the knee. His voice, raw from the night's exertions, rang out across the silent, frost-rimed valley as he recited the words of their covenant, adapting them now for their son. He declared Abel the firstborn of Hillcrest, the progenitor of a people who would never know the taint of the world that was. Then, he lowered the infant into the frigid water. Abel's scream was a sharp, shocked thing, a protest against the cold that they interpreted as the expulsion of any lingering worldly spirit. As Ezekiel lifted him, dripping and wailing, back into the air, they believed they saw a faint golden light shimmer around his small form for a single heart-stopping moment. It was the sign they had craved. Serafina rushed forward, her own discomfort forgotten, to wrap her son in the blanket, her hands soothing him not just as a mother, but as a high priestess tending to a sacred vessel. They returned to the cabin, the three of them bound now by more than blood, by a ceremony that had sealed their shared destiny in the icy waters of their private Jordan. That evening, before the hearth, they made their final vow. Kneeling with Abel resting in a basket between them, they placed their hands upon his tiny chest, feeling the frantic, bird-like beat of his heart. They swore an oath to the shadows on the walls and the God in their minds, a promise spoken in low, fervent tones. They would raise him in absolute purity. He would know nothing of the world beyond their stockade. He would learn only the scriptures they wrote, speak only the words they taught him, and believe only the truth they had crafted. His food would be what they grew or hunted. His thoughts would be shaped by their rituals. His very soul would be a fortress against a contamination that, to him, would never have existed. This child was their validation, their future, and their ultimate project. In the days that followed, Abel's presence solidified the colony's purpose in a way no vision or ritual ever could. He was a living, breathing fact. Serafina's journal entries now overflowed with details of his progress, each gurgle interpreted as a divine utterance, each grasp of her finger a sign of his holy strength. Ezekiel's patrols took on a new, paternal ferocity. He was no longer just guarding an idea, but an heir. The cabin, once a shelter for two deluded souls, was now a nursery for a new world. The future of Hillcrest Colony was no longer an abstract promise whispered in prayer. It slept in a cradle by the fire, its tiny fists clenched, its dreams already being written for it, its entire life a path laid down with the unyielding stone of his parents' fanaticism. The firstborn had arrived, and with him the delusion took root, ready to be inherited. The seasons turned in a relentless, silent wheel, each revolution etching the passage of time not on a calendar, but on the growing bodies and multiplying souls within the stockade. Abel, the firstborn, was no longer the swaddled infant bathed in icy water but a lean, serious boy of 7. His eyes holding the same unnerving stillness as his father's. The world, for him, was exactly the size of the clearing, bounded by the thorn-woven palisade and crowned by the slice of sky visible between the ridge tops. His universe was defined by ritual, his understanding of creation shaped entirely by the stories told in the firelight. He knew the words to the nightly covenant by heart, his small voice a clear, unwavering echo of Ezekiel's, and he accepted without question that the shadowy forest beyond the wall was a void, a graveyard for the wicked, while their small plot of land was the entirety of God's good earth. Then the colony grew. First came a daughter, whom Seraphina named Patience, her birth another miracle confirming their divine favor. Then another girl, Mercy, and later a second son, Hezekiah. The cabin grew more crowded, the air thick with the scent of wood smoke, stewed herbs, and the simple, animal warmth of young life. The single room was now partitioned by hanging blankets, the cradle replaced by rough-hewn bunks stacked against the wall. The family was becoming a clan, a small, self-contained humanity unfolding according to the blueprint of the original vision. Ezekiel's role evolved from prophet to patriarch and sole pedagogue. Each afternoon, he gathered the children before him on the hard-packed earth outside the cabin. Using a sharpened stick, he drew in the dirt, illustrating the lessons that were the foundation of their existence. But the scriptures he taught were not those of the heavy family Bible, which now remained closed on a special shelf, its contents deemed too mingled with the old world's misinterpretations. Instead, he taught from his own memory, a twisted tapestry woven from half-remembered psalms, apocalyptic fragments, and the dictates of his own revelations. He spoke of a great fire that had cleansed the land beyond the trees, a fire that still smoldered in the hearts of the unclean who sometimes wandered, lost and dangerous, in the woods. He taught them that their mother's journal was a sacred text, second only to God's silent will, and that its words were the ultimate law. The children listened, their young minds fertile ground for the seeds of inherited truth, their reality carefully pruned of any curiosity about the world outside. That journal, Seraphina's legacy, had indeed become the colony's most holy relic. Its cover was now soft and stained from years of handling, its pages filled with her elegant script, which had grown more frantic and ornate with time. It was no longer a private diary but a liturgical object. During important rituals, Ezekiel would hold it aloft, its pages open to a passage that justified a new rule or explained a hardship as a divine test. The children were taught to treat it with a reverence that bordered on fear. They believed it contained the direct words of God, whispered to their mother, the new Eve, and to question its contents was the highest blasphemy, a sin that could call down the lingering fire upon them all. And so the family expanded not organically, but according to a rigid, fear-based design. The rules against outside influence were the bedrock of their existence, repeated so often they became as instinctual as breathing. The palisade was both a physical and a mental boundary, and the children learned from their first steps that to approach it was to invite a swift, sharp correction. Their play was mimicry of their parents' work, building tiny stick fences, pretending to carve symbols on logs, caring for cloth doll infants with a solemnity that was far beyond their years. They were happy in their way, their world small but full of purpose, their lives a continuous performance of a faith they had never chosen, but which had been poured into them like water into a vessel, filling every hollow, leaving no room for anything else. The generations had begun, a line of children raised in a cage of their parents' making, the bars forged from twisted scripture and the sacred, unassailable pages of a madwoman's journal. The blood of the lamb steamed in the cool morning air, a rich, coppery scent that clung to the clothes and hair of the gathered colony. The animal, a yearling you chosen for its unblemished white fleece, lay still on the flat stone altar Ezekiel had dragged to the center of the clearing years before. Its throat had been slit with a single, practiced motion, the act performed not with anger, but with a chilling, ceremonial precision. This was no longer just a family huddled in a cabin. Hillcrest had grown into a small, solemn congregation of 12, and its rituals had deepened, evolving from whispered words and burnt trinkets into something darker, more visceral and profoundly binding. The symbolic sacrifice, performed at each new moon, was the pinnacle of their shared devotion, a stark reminder of the price of purity and the ever-present need to atone for sins they could only imagine. Ezekiel, now an old man, presided over the ceremony. His back was stooped, his once powerful frame grown gaunt, but his eyes burned with an undimmed fire. As the lamb's blood pooled and dripped into the clay bowl held by a trembling adolescent boy, Ezekiel raised his crimson-stained hands to the sky. His voice, though raspier now, still carried the weight of absolute authority. He spoke of the sacrifice as a necessary offering, an echo of a greater sacrifice made in a world they had been spared from. The blood was not just spilled. It was consecrated, sprinkled on the altar stones and upon the foreheads of each member, a tangible mark of their separation from the imagined corruption beyond the trees. The younger children watched with wide, fearful eyes, the metallic smell and the sight of the lifeless animal imprinting upon them a deep, instinctual understanding of obedience and fear. This deepening of ritual extended to the very food they ate. New taboos, revealed to Ezekiel during his long vigils, were strictly enforced. The fat of any animal was forbidden, declared unclean, and was meticulously cut away and burned. Certain berries, once gathered freely, were now deemed knowledge berries. Their consumption a dangerous flirtation with the sin of Eve. The rules were arbitrary, born from the swirling paranoia in Ezekiel's mind, but they were enforced as divine law. Meals became acts of devotion and caution, a constant reinforcement of the boundaries that defined their lives. To eat the wrong thing was not merely to break a rule. It was to invite spiritual contamination into the heart of the colony, a transgression that required public confession. It was during the weekly confession ceremonies, held in the firelit cabin after the evening meal, that Ezekiel's power was most absolute. The family, from the eldest to the youngest, would sit in a circle on the hard earth floor. Ezekiel would stand before the hearth, Seraphina's journal in his hand like a judge's gavel. One by one, they were expected to confess their sins. These were not acts of theft or violence, for such things were unknown in their closed world. Instead, they confessed to thoughts. A teenage girl, her face flushed with shame, would whisper that she had felt a flicker of resentment when asked to mend a tunic for the third time. A young boy would admit to a moment of curiosity about the sound of a distant bird he could not identify, a sound that might have come from beyond the wall. These admissions of entirely human feelings were treated as grave spiritual failings, sins of worldly thought that threatened the colony's fragile purity. Ezekiel would listen, his face a granite mask, before pronouncing a penance. Extra prayers, a day of fasting, or the most dreaded punishment, a night spent alone outside the cabin door in the dark. The air in the cabin would grow thick with a potent mixture of fear, relief, and a twisted sense of righteousness. The confessors, having unburdened themselves, felt a cleansing, while the listeners were reminded of the constant vigilance required to keep their own minds in check. For the younger generation, those like Abel's children who had known no other life, these ceremonies forged their reality. Obedience was not just a virtue. It was a matter of survival, a way to escape the terrifying scrutiny of their aging prophet and the God they believed spoke through him. The rituals had deepened, weaving a web of fear and devotion so tight that it was now indistinguishable from the very air they breathed, a legacy of control that would be far harder to escape than any physical stockade. The truth arrived not with a shout, but with the silent, crumbling decay of a single yellowed page. Caleb, a boy of 15 with his grandfather's intense eyes and a restless mind that the colony's rigid walls could not fully contain, had been digging near the creek's edge, searching for fat night crawlers to bait his fishing line. His trowel hit something that was neither rock nor root, a rusted metal box, its lid fused shut by years of mud and corrosion. Prying it open with a stubbornness born of boredom and innate curiosity, he found its contents were a sodden, blackened mass, all but one item. Wrapped in a disintegrating sheet of oilcloth was a single, miraculously preserved page from a newspaper, the Louisville Courier-Journal. The date, printed in a bold, archaic font, was October 15, 1925. Caleb's breath hitched. According to the sacred history, the world had ended in a divine conflagration in the autumn of 1924. This paper was from a year after the fire that never was. His heart hammered against his ribs as his eyes, trained to find meaning in every symbol, scanned the brittle page. There were advertisements for Ford automobiles and Gibson girl dresses. A headline detailed a local political scandal. A society column announced a wedding. It was a chronicle of mundane, bustling life, a world carrying on with trivial human concerns. There was no mention of apocalypse, no ashes, no silence. The paper was a fossil from a world that had not died, but had simply continued without them. The foundation of everything he had ever been taught, the very ground of his existence, gave a sickening lurch. He hid the paper inside his shirt, the feel of it against his skin like a brand. For days, he moved through the colony's routines like a ghost, the words from the dead world screaming in his mind during the nightly covenant recitations. He watched his elders, his own father, Abel, now a stern man echoing Ezekiel's grim authority with new eyes. He saw not prophets and keepers of divine truth, but custodians of a lie. The fear in their eyes during confessions now looked less like piety and more like terror of being found out. The weight of his secret became unbearable, a stone in his gut that grew heavier with every enforced prayer and every warning about the cursed world beyond. The confrontation finally erupted during a lesson on the colony's founding. Ezekiel, now so frail he taught from a chair by the hearth, was recounting the vision of the holy fire, his voice a thin, reedy imitation of its former power. Caleb could stand it no longer. He stepped forward, his hands trembling, and unfolded the decaying newspaper. The air in the cabin seemed to freeze solid. He did not shout. His voice was low, trembling with a mixture of terror and a strange, exhilarating clarity. He held the page out, pointing to the date, reading the mundane headlines that proved the world had been alive and well, building cars and planning weddings, while his grandparents were building a cabin and carving delusions into trees. The reaction was not the stunned silence of revelation, but the immediate, violent backlash of a faith threatened. Ezekiel's face, already a roadmap of wrinkles, contorted into a mask of outraged fury. He pointed a shaking, accusatory finger at Caleb, his voice cracking as he declared the newspaper a demonic trick, a foul artifact sent from the unclean to test their faith. Abel rose to his feet, his expression a storm of betrayal and fear. He did not look at the paper, but at his son, and in his eyes was the cold fire of the heresy hunter. He accused Caleb of consorting with phantoms, of allowing his mind to be poisoned by worldly thoughts, of digging up corruption and bringing it into their holy midst. The other elders joined the chorus, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of condemnation. They did not see evidence. They saw blasphemy. They did not see a questioning boy. They saw a dangerous crack in the wall of their reality, a crack that had to be sealed immediately, with force if necessary. Caleb stood his ground, the fragile paper his only shield, watching the faces of his family twist into something monstrous and unfamiliar, realizing with a cold, sinking dread that the truth was not something they wanted. It was a contagion, and he was its carrier. The crunch of a boot on dry leaves, a sound alien and utterly wrong, shattered the colony's perpetual morning quiet. It was a noise that did not belong to the familiar rhythm of their existence. Not the soft pad of bare feet on packed earth, not the rustle of a foraging animal, but the heavy, deliberate tread of leather on forest floor. Every member of Hillcrest froze in their tasks, their heads snapping up like startled deer. The sound came from beyond the eastern section of the palisade, a place where the woods were thickest and the barrier most vulnerable. It was the sound of the dead world, the phantom realm they had walled out for a generation, and it was now walking, breathing, and hunting on their sacred ground. Ezekiel, who had been dozing in a patch of sunlight by the cabin door, was jolted awake by the collective intake of breath. His old eyes, clouded with age but still burning with the embers of his fanaticism, focused on the source of the disruption. He did not see a lost man. He saw a walking corruption, a living breach in their divine quarantine. A tremor ran through his frail body, but his voice, when it came, was a dry, rusted command that cut through the silence. He pointed a gnarled finger toward the wall, his whole arm shaking with the effort. He ordered the capture. His sons and grandsons, their faces pale with a fear that was equal parts terror and trained obedience, moved as one. They were not hunters stalking prey. They were white blood cells converging on a pathogen, their movements swift, silent, and terrifyingly efficient. The man was a hunter from a town 30 miles away, separated from his party 2 days prior. He was tired, hungry, and utterly bewildered. One moment he was following a deer trail, the next he was surrounded by a dozen silent, wild-eyed figures emerging from the undergrowth. They did not speak. They simply closed in, their hands gripping his arms with a strength that brooked no resistance, and marched him through a hidden gap in the thorny barricade. He was dragged into the center of the clearing and forced to his knees before the ancient, furious patriarch. The hunter's eyes, wide with confusion and dawning fear, scanned the scene. The crude cabins, the grim-faced people in their homespun clothes, the absolute, unnerving silence that had fallen over the entire community. This was not a settlement. It was a relic, a pocket of time sealed away and gone terribly wrong. The intimidation was a choreographed performance of collective madness. The family formed a tight, silent circle around him, their faces devoid of pity. Ezekiel, supported by his son Abel, leaned over the kneeling man, his breath a foul whisper. He did not ask questions about the outside world. He pronounced judgment upon it. He spoke of the great fire, the cleansing, the sin that still clung to the hunter like a visible stench. He called him an unclean spirit, a ghost from the graveyard of the old earth. The hunter tried to stammer an explanation, to say he was lost, to offer the name of his town, but his words were swallowed by the intense, unblinking stares of the colonists. A young woman stepped forward and spat at his feet. A child threw a small, sharp stone that struck his shoulder. It was not the violence that was terrifying, but the cold, ritualistic certainty behind it. They were not angry people. They were exorcists, and he was the demon they were casting out. After what felt like an eternity, the message was deemed delivered. The hunter, trembling and pale, was hauled back to his feet and dragged back through the gap in the wall. He was shoved roughly into the forest, the thorns tearing at his jacket. The last thing he saw before the foliage closed behind him was the entire colony standing in a line, watching him with flat, dead eyes, their postures radiating a final, unspoken warning. He did not need to be told twice. He turned and ran, the image of that hidden, cursed valley and its broken people seared into his mind, a story he would never dare to tell. Inside the stockade, a fragile, triumphant silence settled. The breach had been sealed. The unclean had been expelled. The elders gathered around Ezekiel, praising his swift judgment, their faith momentarily reinforced by the successful defense of their reality. But on the edge of the gathering, Caleb stood apart, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. He had watched the entire spectacle, and where the others saw a divine victory, he saw only the terrified face of a lost man and the brutal mechanics of a lie being protected. The hunter's modern boots, his factory-stitched jacket, the sheer normalcy of his fear. It had all screamed the truth that the newspaper had only whispered. The world was not a smoldering ruin. It was out there, living and breathing, and his family were not its holy guardians, but its terrified, fanatical prisoners. The intrusion was over, but it had left a crack in Caleb's soul that no amount of ritual or fear could ever seal again. His suspicion was no longer a quiet doubt. It was a cold, hard certainty, and it had just been given a human face. The trunk was a hulking, iron-banded relic squatting in the perpetual twilight of the colony's storage shed, a place that smelled of dust, dried herbs, and forgotten time. For Alara, it was a landmark of her childhood. A monster in the corner she and the other children had dared each other to touch during illicit games of hide and seek. Now, at 17, she saw it not as a monster, but as a puzzle box. A recent violent storm had shaken the old shed, dislodging a section of roofing and sending a cascade of rainwater down the wall behind the trunk. The moisture had warped the floorboards, shifting the trunk's weight and popping the rusted lock that had held its secrets for decades. Curiosity, a dangerous and carefully suppressed impulse in Hillcrest, flared within her. With a furtive glance over her shoulder towards the main clearing, she knelt before the trunk. The lid groaned open on protesting hinges, releasing a sigh of cedar and decay. Inside, beneath a layer of moth-eaten wool blankets, she found it. Not a toy or a tool, but a book. Its leather cover was soft and supple with age, stained dark in places, and embossed with a faded, intricate pattern that was not a cross or a lamb, but an intertwining vine of flowers. It felt alien, personal, and utterly out of place. There was no title, but when she carefully opened it, the first page bore a single name, written in an elegant, flowing hand that spoke of a different world. Seraphina. Alara's breath caught. This was the sacred text, the holy word their entire lives were built upon. But this physical object felt nothing like the untouchable, fearsome relic evoked during grandfather's sermons. This felt intimate. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she turned the brittle, yellowed pages. She expected to find the familiar, rigid scriptures of the covenant, the divine pronouncements she had memorized since infancy. Instead, she found a woman. The early entries were filled with a trembling, hopeful prose that described the vision, the journey, the founding of the valley. But woven between the lines of faith were threads of something else. Seraphina wrote of the deep, gnawing cold of that first winter, of the way the silence sometimes felt like a weight pressing down on her chest. She described Ezekiel's growing agitation, his sleepless nights staring into the trees, and called it not prophetic vigilance, but a fretful spirit in one chilling passage. She confessed to a moment of pure, unvarnished terror when she realized she could no longer clearly recall her own mother's face, writing that the memory had slipped away like smoke, leaving only the ghost of a feeling. These were not the words of a divinely appointed Eve. They were the words of a frightened, lonely woman, clinging to a delusion because the alternative was unthinkable. The deeper Alara read, the more the inconsistencies piled up, each one a crack spiderwebbing across the flawless surface of the colony's history. Seraphina documented signs that were clearly the results of hunger and exhaustion. A talking fox that was likely a dream, a vision of an angel that appeared during a fever. She wrote of carving the biblical symbols into the trees not as a holy act, but as a way to calm Ezekiel's rising paranoia, to make the wilderness feel like a home and not a prison. The most damning entry was a simple, desperate question, scrawled in a shaky hand and then heavily crossed out, but still legible beneath the ink. What if we were wrong? A cold dread, entirely separate from the shed's chill, seeped into Alara's bones. This journal was not a testament of divine truth. It was a chronicle of a slow-mounting madness, a document of two people convincing each other of a reality that did not exist. The sacred covenant, the nightly rituals, the absolute purity. It was all a fortress built not on a rock of faith, but on the shifting sands of shared delusion. The family history she had been taught, the very reason for her existence within these walls, was a story. A lie carefully maintained and passed down like a cursed heirloom. She closed the journal, its weight now immense in her hands, and looked out through the cracked shed door at the familiar clearing. The cabins, the altar stone, the faces of her family going about their daily chores. None of it looked the same. The entire world of Hillcrest Colony, every ritual and every rule, was now cast in the sinister, flickering light of a terrible and growing unease. The journal was a ghost in Alara's hands, its whispered secrets now a constant, screaming presence in her mind. The world of Hillcrest, once a tapestry of divine certainty, had frayed overnight, every thread of her faith pulled loose by Seraphina's desperate, crossed-out words. The familiar morning rituals felt like a pantomime performed on a stage she now knew was hollow. As she knelt with the others for the dawn recitation, the words of the covenant tasted like ash on her tongue. She watched her grandfather, the current leader, his voice echoing Ezekiel's old fervor, and saw not a prophet but a man desperately propping up a crumbling edifice, his eyes holding not divine light but the frantic gleam of a guardian who fears his own walls are made of paper. This new, terrible knowledge demanded action. The storage shed became her sanctuary, a dusty confessional where she returned again and again, not to pray, but to investigate. She combed through the trunk with a meticulous, trembling urgency, pushing past the wool blankets and the scent of decay. Her fingers, slick with a nervous sweat, brushed against something else tucked into a corner, a small, leather-wrapped bundle. Unfolding it, She found a collection of artifacts that should not have existed in a world cleansed by holy fire. A tarnished silver thimble, a single pearl earring, and beneath them, carefully preserved between two pieces of oilcloth, the same decaying page of the Louisville Courier-Journal that had once damned her Uncle Caleb. The date, October 15, 1925, was a stark, black-and-white indictment. She held the fragile paper, feeling its truth burn against her skin, a tangible confirmation that the apocalypse was a story, a nightmare mistaken for prophecy. Armed with this evidence, she began a quieter, more dangerous investigation, seeking out the oldest members of the colony, those whose memories predated the full hardening of the dogma. Her great-aunt Ruth, now so ancient and bent she seemed to be folding back into the earth, was her first source. Alara found her sitting in a sunbeam, her gnarled hands worrying a threadbare shawl. She did not ask direct questions, knowing such bluntness would be reported as heresy. Instead, she spoke in gentle circles, asking about the early days, about Serafina. The old woman's eyes, milky with cataracts, grew distant. Her voice, a dry rustle, hinted at things never spoken aloud. She mentioned Ezekiel's fretful spells, times when he would rage at the wind, calling it the voice of the damned. She whispered that Serafina, in her later years, would sometimes wander the clearing at night, calling out for a sister named Clara, a woman from the world that was supposed to be ash and memory. "The past is a stubborn ghost, child," Ruth murmured, her gaze sharpening for a fleeting moment, landing on Alara with a startling clarity. "It doesn't burn so easy. Some of us, we remember the before. We learned not to speak of it." But the colony was a single, watchful organism, and Alara's quiet inquiries did not go unnoticed. The subtle shift in her demeanor, her lingering near the elders, the way her eyes now held a calculating light where once there was only placid acceptance. It was all noted. The resistance began not with a shout, but with a chilling, organized pressure. Her uncle Josiah, her grandfather's stern enforcer, cornered her one evening as she carried water from the creek. He did not accuse her directly. Instead, he spoke in low, menacing tones about the importance of unity, of the dangers of straying thoughts, of the sin of curiosity that had poisoned Cain. His words were a warning shot across her bow, a reminder that the walls of their reality were patrolled by zealots. The confrontation escalated at the next weekly gathering. Her grandfather, holding Serafina's journal aloft as if it were a shield against doubt, delivered a sermon that was clearly meant for her ears alone. His voice thundered about the absolute truth of their founding, the divine nature of their isolation. Then his eyes, cold and flinty, found hers in the crowd. He spoke of a new sickness slinking through the colony, a sickness of the mind he called the blasphemy of inquiry. He did not name her, but every head turned subtly in her direction. He declared that to question the sacred history was to spit upon the sacrifices of their ancestors, to side with the unclean phantoms of the dead world, to invite a spiritual rot that would destroy them all. The label was now officially hung around her neck. Blasphemer. The weight of it was immense, a brand of isolation more profound than any physical barrier. She sat perfectly still, the newspaper clipping and Ruth's whispered confessions burning like coals in her mind, realizing that unraveling the past was not an academic exercise. It was a rebellion, and she was now a solitary soldier in a holy war against her own family's sanity. The final, damning piece of evidence was not hidden in a trunk or whispered by a dying relative. It was written in the very flesh and blood of the colony itself. Alara's investigation, now forced into the deepest shadows by her grandfather's public branding of her as a blasphemer, turned from dusty artifacts to living bodies. She began to see Hillcrest not as a holy sanctuary, but as a clinical case study, and the symptoms of its sickness were everywhere, painted in the subtle, cruel strokes of inherited suffering. The truth, when it finally coalesced, was not a single revelation but a constellation of horrors, each one illuminating the others in a ghastly, undeniable light. It began with the children. Little Miriam, her cousin's daughter, had been born with a heart that fluttered like a trapped bird, a weakness that required her to sit quietly while others her age worked and played. Another boy, Samuel, was plagued by seizures that the elders called visitations. Moments where he would collapse, his body rigid, his eyes rolled back in his head. Alara had always accepted these as mysterious trials, divine tests of the colony's faith. But now, with Serafina's journal screaming in her mind and the 1925 newspaper tucked safely in a hidden crevice of the shed, she saw a different pattern. She started a secret tally, a grim catalogue of the colony's ailments, the frequent stillbirths, the cleft palates that had been hastily explained as the mark of a thoughtful soul, the pervasive lethargy and strange skeletal deformities in some of the older members. These were not acts of God. They were the predictable, biological consequences of a closed gene pool. Generation upon generation of cousins marrying cousins, of uncles wedding nieces, all in the name of preserving a purity that was, in reality, a curse. The health issues were not misfortunes. They were the signature of inbreeding, the physical proof that their divine mission was a biological dead end. This grim understanding reframed everything, especially the colony's origin story. No longer was Ezekiel a prophet who saw a holy fire. He was a man broken by the wilderness. Alara pictured him, not as the stern patriarch of legend, but as a frightened farmer, his mind buckling under the immense, crushing weight of their self-imposed isolation. The shared vision was not a divine communique but a folie à deux, a shared psychotic disorder born from extreme stress, hunger, and the terrifying emptiness of the woods. Serafina's journal entries about his fretful spirit and paranoid episodes were not descriptions of prophetic zeal. They were the clinical notes on a mental breakdown. The great apocalypse had never happened. The world had not ended. It had simply turned its back on two lost souls, and in that silence, their sanity had unraveled, weaving a catastrophic delusion that became the bedrock of their descendants' lives. The final, chilling realization struck her with the force of a physical blow as she watched the nightly covenant ceremony. The family was gathered, their faces illuminated by the fire, their voices rising in the familiar, rhythmic chant. She saw not a congregation of faithful, but a line of prisoners, each one shackled by a chain of inherited delusion. Their faith was not a living, breathing belief nurtured by genuine spiritual experience. It was a phantom limb, a set of behaviors and fears passed down through the generations like a genetic trait. They believed not because they had encountered the divine, but because their parents had, and their grandparents before them, all the way back to that single, fractured moment in a Kentucky farmhouse. Their entire world, their identity, their purpose. It was all built on the foundation of one man's madness, cemented by isolation, and perpetuated by the simple, devastating act of telling a story to their children. The rituals, the taboos, the sacred border of the palisade. It was all a grand, tragic performance designed to keep the terrifying truth at bay, that they were not God's chosen people, but the lost descendants of a madman, living in a self-made prison for a crime that never occurred. The curse of Hillcrest was not a divine punishment. It was a lie, and it had been flowing through their veins, unacknowledged and unchallenged, for nearly a century. The air in the main cabin was thick with the scent of wood smoke and unspoken dread, a palpable tension that made every breath feel like a struggle. Alara stood before the gathered elders, her grandfather seated in his high-backed chair like a king upon a crumbling throne. In her hands, she held the damning evidence, Serafina's journal, the brittle newspaper page, and her own secret notes detailing the colony's litany of health issues. The moment had arrived, a collision point between the lie that had sustained them for generations and the truth that threatened to shatter their world into irreparable fragments. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs, but her voice, when she finally spoke, was low and steady, a calm river cutting through the stagnant air. She began not with accusation, but with history, reading directly from Serafina's own hand the passages of doubt and fear, the descriptions of Ezekiel's descent into paranoia that had been carefully excised from the colony's official lore. She held up the newspaper, its mundane headlines from 1925 a silent scream against the myth of the apocalypse. Finally, she laid out her grim catalogue of the colony's suffering, the weak hearts, the seizures, the deformities, linking them not to divine tests but to the simple, brutal science of inbreeding. She presented it all not as an attack, but as a plea, a desperate attempt to free them from a curse they had never asked to inherit. She spoke of a world outside, not of fire and ash, but of life and medicine and answers. For a long moment, there was only silence, a vacuum of sound that seemed to suck the very oxygen from the room. Then her grandfather moved. It was not the slow, pained rise of an old man, but a sudden, violent uncoiling. His face, a landscape of wrinkles and sunken flesh, contorted into a mask of pure, incandescent rage. The calm Alara had presented was a spark to the tinder of his fanaticism. He surged to his feet, knocking his chair backward with a clatter that echoed like a gunshot. His finger, bony and trembling, stabbed toward her, his voice erupting not in reasoned denial, but in a guttural roar that invoked divine wrath. He called down the fire of heaven upon her, denounced her evidence as poison spewed from the mouth of Satan, and declared her a vessel of corruption, an unclean thing that had to be cast out before her blasphemy infected them all. Spittle flew from his lips as he screamed, his eyes wide and unseeing, lost in the storm of his own denial. The eruption shattered the fragile stillness of the room. The family, once a unified congregation, splintered instantly into a chaos of conflicting loyalties and raw emotion. Alara's mother let out a choked sob, her hands flying to her mouth, her eyes darting between her daughter and her raving father, her sanity stretched taut between love and a lifetime of indoctrination. Her uncle Josiah stepped forward, his face a stony echo of the patriarch's fury, his loyalty a blind, unwavering shield for the old ways. But others stood frozen, their faces etched with a dawning, terrible shock. They looked at the journal in Alara's hand, then at the raving old man, and the bedrock of their reality gave a violent, nauseating lurch. Whispers of confusion and fear rippled through the room, a cacophony of fractured faith. A young cousin, who had always looked at Alara with admiration, now stared at her with wide, terrified eyes as if she were a monster. An aunt who had secretly tended to a child's deformity with herbal poultices now looked at her own hands as if seeing them for the first time, the possibility that her efforts had been futile against a man-made curse crashing down upon her. The confrontation was no longer an argument. It was a seismic event, testing the very sanity of every soul in the room, forcing them to choose between the comforting prison of their inherited delusion and the terrifying, uncharted wilderness of the truth. In the hollow silence that followed the storm of her grandfather's rage, the colony stood on a precipice, its collective soul fractured. The truth, once a hidden seed, had now burst into the open, a thorny, undeniable weed strangling the garden of their faith. The confrontation had not ended with resolution, but with a rupture, leaving the family scattered across the clearing like debris after an explosion. Some stood rooted near the cabin, their faces pale and their eyes wide with a shock that was slowly hardening into denial, clinging to the familiar shores of their dogma as if it were the only solid ground in a suddenly churning sea. Others had drifted away from the main group, huddling near the creek or beneath the ancient, carved trees, their postures slumped, their minds reeling as they turned over Alara's evidence like stones, searching for a foothold in this new, terrifying landscape. The first cracks of acceptance appeared not in the elders, but in the younger generation and those who had borne the physical weight of the colony's secret curse. Alara's mother found her later that evening, not with anger, but with tears streaking through the grime on her face. She did not speak of faith or blasphemy. She spoke of her sister, stillborn and blue, and of her own son's weak lungs that made him gasp for air on cold nights. She clutched Alara's hands, her grip desperate, and whispered a single, broken question about the world outside, about doctors and medicines that could mend what prayers and poultices had failed to fix. Her defection was quiet, but it was a seismic shift. Others followed, drawn by the same desperate hope. They came to Alara under the cover of darkness, their voices hushed, their eyes haunted by the same dawning realization, that the curse was not a divine test to be endured, but a man-made prison from which they could potentially escape. But for every soul that leaned toward the light of truth, another retreated deeper into the shadows of belief. Her grandfather, though physically spent, became a spectral figure of unwavering defiance, his voice a constant, low murmur from the cabin, reciting the old covenants and invoking protection against the spirit of lies. His most loyal followers, led by Uncle Josiah, formed a grim, protective cordon around him, their eyes regarding Alara and her growing faction with a mixture of fear and venomous contempt. They tightened their grip on the remaining rituals, their prayers becoming more fervent, their adherence to the taboos more rigid, as if by sheer force of will they could rebuild the walls that Alara's truth had battered down. The colony was now two worlds occupying the same small patch of earth, separated by an invisible, uncrossable chasm of belief. It was Alara who gave voice to the inevitable conclusion. Standing before the small group that had gathered around her near the storage shed, she did not speak of blame or victory. She spoke of survival. She painted a quiet, painful picture of a life beyond the palisade, not as a sinful wasteland, but as a place of learning and healing, where their children could grow strong and their minds could be free. She advocated for leaving Hillcrest, for stepping out of the shadow of the curse and into the uncertain, but real world. Her words were met with a profound, trembling silence, followed by a slow, grim nodding of heads. The decision was made. The morning of their departure dawned gray and damp, a mist clinging to the valley like a shroud. The farewells were not dramatic, but quiet and gut-wrenchingly final. There were no embraces between the two factions, only long, sorrowful looks across the clearing. A brother parted from a sister, a daughter from a father, their shared history now a gulf between them. Those leaving packed meager bundles, a change of clothes, a treasured keepsake, a pouch of dried food. As Alara led her small band toward the gap in the eastern palisade, the one through which the hunter had been expelled years before, she paused and looked back. The ones who stayed stood watching, their faces a mosaic of judgment, fear, and a heartbreaking, stubborn faith. No one waved. The silence was a language of its own, speaking of a century of shared madness and a loss too profound for words. Then, Alara turned, took a deep breath of the free, damp air, and stepped through the wall of thorns, leading the first of Hillcrest's children out of the wilderness of their ancestors, making and into the fragile, hopeful beginning of reconciliation with a world they had never known. The forest had begun its reclamation, a slow, green tide swallowing the scars of human habitation. Alara pushed aside a curtain of Virginia creeper, the leaves cool and damp against her palm, and stepped into the clearing. It was not the Hillcrest of her memory, a place humming with the grim industry of faith, but a ghost of it. The cabins were skeletal ruins, their roofs caved in, their walls bowed and softened by rot and moss. The central altar stone was a dark, wet island in a sea of ferns, and the palisade was no longer a fearsome barrier but a crumbling line of gray, tooth-like stumps being digested by the earth. The air, once thick with wood smoke and whispered prayers, now carried only the clean, damp scent of decay and growing things. Silence, true and absolute, had finally returned to the valley. Years had passed since she had led that small, trembling band through the eastern gap in the wall. Years of blinking in the shocking brightness of a world that was not on fire, of learning the mundane miracles of electricity, of medicine, of a sky unobstructed by a cage of thorns and fear. She had built a life, a real one, on the outside. She had a small house with a garden she tended for pleasure, not survival. She had friends who knew nothing of covenants or holy fires. She had a daughter, a bright-eyed girl who would never have to confess a sinful thought or fear the shape of her own curiosity. Yet the valley had called her back. Not with a voice, but with a weight, a gravitational pull from the past that she could no longer ignore. She walked through the ruins, her boots sinking into the soft, leaf-strewn earth. Here was the foundation of the main cabin, where her grandfather's rage had once shaken the very walls. There was the storage shed, a collapsed skeleton, its secrets long since returned to the elements. With each step, she mourned. She mourned not for the lies, but for the lost generations who had lived and died within these walls, their entire world of fiction carved into trees and written in a desperate woman's journal. She mourned for the children like little Miriam, whose fragile hearts had given out under the strain of a curse they never understood. She mourned for the potential stifled, the minds narrowed, the lives lived in service to a madman's dream. The sorrow was a physical ache, a hollowed-out space inside her that was filled with the echoes of all that had been wasted here. But as her gaze swept over the ruins, now being gently dismantled by vine and weather, she felt something else, too, a fragile, tenacious hope. The cycle was broken. The inheritance of madness had ended with her generation. Her daughter would know the truth. Her cousins who had left were building lives, seeking therapy, falling in love with people who had never heard of Hillcrest Colony. They were breaking their own chains one by one. The curse had not been lifted in a single dramatic moment. It was being outlived, day by quiet day, in the simple, courageous act of living an authentic life. The colony was not a holy ground, but a grave for a delusion, and from that grave, something new was finally growing. Yet, as she turned to leave, the shadows of the curse lingered, clinging to the edges of the clearing like mist. They were in the family memories that were not so easily shed. The way her mother would sometimes startle at a loud noise, her first instinct still to hide. The recurring nightmare her brother had of being chased through an endless forest by his own grandfather's face. The reflexive guilt Alara herself sometimes felt when she enjoyed a piece of music or a story too much, a ghost of the old taboo against worldly pleasure. The madness was gone, but its echo remained, a subtle tremor in their blood. A story they would have to tell and retell to keep its power at bay. She took one last look at the valley, at the sun breaking through the canopy to illuminate the ruins not as a sacred site, but as a historical one. A place of tragedy, yes, but also of survival. Then, Alara turned her back on the ghosts of Hillcrest and walked into the living, breathing world, carrying the weight of the past, but stepping firmly into the light of a new beginning.